Although it is uncommon, it is not unprecedented for teenagers or children to be sentenced to many years in prison for serious crime. In the United States, depending on the severity of the offense, some states allow the transfer of young people from the juvenile system to the adult criminal system, even if they are only 12 years old. Laws vary from state to state and from country to country, each defining how to deal with young offenders. What remains constant is the brutality of the crimes committed. In this video, you will learn about some young people and children whose actions are truly shocking, having committed some of the most heinous crimes imaginable. Without exaggeration, the last two cases on this list are particularly cruel. Hello. It's a pleasure to be with you again. I hope everything is well. Currently, the most brutal cases involving children and teenagers that we know of occur in the United States. There, despite variations in state laws, there is no constitutionally established minimum age for life imprisonment, which means that even children can receive this sentence. The death penalty for minors under 18 was banned in 2005, regardless of the crime committed, and believe me, there have been many serious crimes. Starting our list, brothers Derek and Alex King became known throughout the United States for a dark reason: the brutal murder of their father, Terry King. To this day, no one fully understands what happened or who the real victim in this story was. Everything happened in the early hours of the 26th of November, 2001, while Terry King was peacefully sleeping for the last time. That night, he was beaten to death by his 12 and 13-year-old sons with a baseball bat. The story doesn't end there, because in addition to killing their father, the two also set the house on fire in an attempt to cover up the crime. It didn't work, and just hours later they confessed the crime to the police. The big issue is that they changed their story several times, making it almost impossible to determine which version is true. Initially, they claimed they acted in self-defense against their father's abuse. Later, they changed their story, saying they were coerced by Ricky Chavez, a family friend who always took them in when they ran away from home. When the police investigated Ricky Chavez, the story became even more bizarre. It was discovered that Ricky had already been arrested for child abuse and possessed various incriminating materials. The story became increasingly complicated, with each person choosing a version to believe. In 2002, the young men Derek and Alex were tried as adults and, after pleading guilty to their father's death, were sentenced to 8 and 7 years in prison, respectively. At the time, Kelly Marino, the boys' mother, said that they still didn't understand the consequences of their actions and didn't know they were going to prison. During an interview she said, "They think they're going to a playground, they really do, they think they're going to be with other kids and have fun." Ricky Chavez was tried separately by a jury, acquitted of any involvement in the murder, but convicted for the illegal material he possessed. After serving their sentences, the King brothers were released from prison, but a youth spent behind bars took its toll. In 2011, Alex King was arrested again after fleeing the scene of a traffic accident without helping the victims. In 2024, at 35 years old, Alex returned to the media spotlight after being found dead due to illicit substance abuse. As for his brother, Derek King, since leaving prison, he chose to live a reclusive life and there is currently no information about him in the media. To this day, it is still unclear what led the brothers to commit such a brutal crime, but it is undeniable that their time in prison stole their youth and brought serious consequences to their lives. Not all stories have a tragic ending, no matter how disturbing and hopeless their beginning may seem. This is the case of Jemarian Livornon, who has one of the most remarkable stories you will ever hear. Jemarian's story began in August 2014. He was only 12 years old and, with a kitchen knife in hand, went to the local playground and attacked another child who was just 9 years old. Jemarian knew exactly what he was doing. In fact, as he himself said, he hoped that after this, he would be killed by the police right away. That was something he wanted. When no one came to him after he committed the crime, he called the police himself and confessed. The recording of the call is disturbing. In it you can hear a 12-year-old child saying, "I just stabbed someone. I'm fed up with life and I want to die. Come get me and lock me up for the rest of my life. Take me to juvenile prison for the rest of my life. Kill me." From the very beginning, it was clear that, as heinous as Jemarian's crime was, there was something more behind this story. Upon investigation, the police discovered that he had been suffering a long history of physical and emotional abuse at home, all at the hands of his stepfather, to the point that it made him give up on life. Jemarian was convicted of first-degree murder, but instead of the death sentence he wanted, he received a hybrid sentence. He would be detained until the age of 21 and, after that period, would be eligible for parole depending on his progress. While serving his sentence, several psychologists visited him, dedicated to helping him in the best way possible. The treatment and all the help he received made progress with Jamarian, who not only managed to open up more, talking about the traumas he suffered in the past, but also became a mentor to new inmates. A beautiful story of overcoming adversity. In 2021, after serving his sentence, he was released from the institution to live with the family that adopted him. Currently, he continues to work in programs supporting at-risk youth and, in addition to being actively involved in a local NGO, he helps young people like himself. His goal is not to justify his actions, but to do everything possible so that other young people do not become victims of abuse and neglect and end up lost, just as he himself was lost in the past. As for the 9-year-old boy who was the victim in this story, he was raised by his grandmother Toni Noahmaker, who turned out to be the strongest person in this story. She says that, at first, she felt hatred, but when she understood what was happening, she was able to forgive the young Jamarian. In her words, she said, "I can't change the past, but I have the ability to choose my response. We need more compassion in this world so that we can become everything we are meant to be. Seriously, who needs more hatred?" Completely different from young Jamarian, the brothers Robert and Michael Beaver have a story with a tragic ending as well as a deeply disturbing beginning. Their case is more recent, having happened in July 2015. On that occasion, the brothers, aged 18 and 16, attacked their parents and their other 3 siblings in a crime they had been planning for months. The reason? All because they wanted to become world-famous serial killers. Detective Rihanna Russell, who was in charge of the case, said they wanted to kill at least 50 people. They wanted to be famous, to have a Wikipedia page and media coverage, as well as recognition from their own family. They revealed that they had plans to go out into the city streets, making new victims. Crystal, their sister who was only 13 years old, was one of the survivors, despite having suffered multiple stab wounds. Their little brother, just 2 years old, also survived, probably forgotten by the brothers. It's impossible for us to know what was going on in the minds of the two, just as it's also difficult to be certain about what was really happening in their home. According to reports from neighbors, the parents were extremely strict, preventing the children from leaving the house or interacting with other kids in the neighborhood. Some neighbors reported that they only learned the brothers' names after seeing them in the newspapers. The brothers themselves say they were physically abused by their parents. But that's not all. At the police station, they confessed to the crime. All the while, they laughed about the atrocities they had just committed. They said their goal was to surpass some of the major massacres in the United States so that they would go down in history. Robert Beaver was sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences, while Michael Beaver also received 5 life sentences, plus an additional 28 years in prison. Neither of them will be getting out anytime soon. Currently, they remain in the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, where they occasionally get into fights inside the prison, mainly with guards. The family home was demolished in 2017 and turned into a community memorial. Today, school shootings are a major problem around the world. However, the United States still suffers greatly from this issue. According to data from the NGO Everything for Gun Safety, there is an average of 100 to 150 school shootings every year. In 2023, for example, more than 100 shootings were recorded, some with fatalities, others with only injuries. Among the many cases that have happened in the past, one stands out. The case of young Barry Dale Lucatus, who was only 14 years old. On the 2nd of February, 1996, young Barry entered his school dressed as an Old West gunslinger. What no one imagined was that the .30 rifle and the 2 pistols he was carrying were not just part of his costume, but real and deadly weapons. A teacher and 2 students were his victims. The situation did not escalate further only because John Lane, the school's physical education teacher, managed to restrain and disarm Barry before he could harm anyone else. Barry's plan was to use the other students as hostages in order to escape, but he ended up being caught by the police before he could put this plan into action. After conducting investigations, it was confirmed that Barry came from a dysfunctional home where his mother, who suffered from severe depression, repeatedly asked him to agree to a pact with her so they could take their own lives together. In addition, he was also a victim of bullying at school. In his own words, he said that he only intended to take the life of one classmate, the young Manuel Vela, and that the other deaths were accidental. During his trial, the defense tried to plead insanity, claiming that Barry suffered from bipolar disorder, but the jury found him responsible for his crimes. He ended up receiving a sentence of 2 life imprisonments, plus an additional 205 years. However, in 2017, he ended up being resentenced, with his sentence reduced to just 189 years in prison. On that occasion, 20 years after the incident, Professor John Lane, who was responsible for restraining Barry and preventing an even greater tragedy, asked him why he did it. For the first time, Barry replied saying, "The short answer is that I was afraid, angry, and jealous. That's not a complete explanation, but I was in a situation where I was going through the same things as all the other kids and I didn't realize it. I didn't know that everyone went through this. And when I started to feel rejected, instead of reaching out to someone or saying something to someone, I just hid it. And instead of facing my own problems and admitting that there was something wrong with me, I projected that behavior onto others. Of all the stories you've seen so far, the last two are certainly the most cruel. Starting with the young Alyssa Bustamante, who at just 15 years old, committed a brutal and inexplicable crime. The murder of a child only 9 years old. At the time, Alyssa was already dealing with issues like depression and self-harm. This was something that greatly worried her family. However, they had no idea that the worst was yet to come. Days before the crime, Alyssa went to a wooded area near her house, where she dug 2 shallow graves. As she later revealed to the Missouri police sergeant, the graves were because she was curious about what it would feel like to kill someone. On the night of the 21st of October, 2009, Alyssa convinced her younger sister to bring their neighbor, 9-year-old Elizabeth Olton, to the site of the graves under the pretense that she would give her a present. When they arrived, Alyssa surprised the young girl by attacking her, cruelly and brutally, until she could no longer resist. This was a premeditated crime, as well as an extremely cruel one. After the investigation, the police had no doubt that Alyssa was responsible for the crime, especially since she had described everything in her diary. Her diary was read in court. It was a strong and brutal account, in which she wrote, "I strangled her, slit her throat, and stabbed her. So now she is dead. I don't know how I'm feeling." It was amazing. Right after the feeling of, "Oh my God, I can't do this," passes. It's actually pleasurable. Now I'm here, like, nervous and shaking. I have to go to church now. At the moment when the police were searching for young Elizabeth, Alyssa was in a dance class at her church. Initially, she pleaded not guilty, and was then charged with first-degree murder. But in 2012, she ended up accepting a plea deal and pleaded guilty. At the time, during the trial, she took the opportunity to try to apologize to the family, saying, "I know words will never be enough, they'll never be able to truly describe just how horrible I feel about all of this. If I could give my life to have her back, I would. I'm sorry." Elizabeth's family refused to comment, referring to Alyssa only as a monster. Her defense continues to argue that what happened was due to various mental health issues, such as depression and personality disorder, claiming it was a failure not to have hospitalized her before the worst happened. Several psychologists analyzed her after the incident, stating that she suffers from major depressive disorder as well as borderline personality disorder. Currently, she remains incarcerated at the Chillicothe Correctional Center, serving a life sentence with an additional 30 years. In July 2024, she attempted a parole hearing, which was denied. At the moment, she will only be eligible for another hearing in 2029, but even then, she still needs to serve the additional sentence. In other words, even if she is granted parole, she would only be able to leave prison in 2059. In 2017, the mother of the young Elizabeth filed a $5 million lawsuit against Alyssa Bustamante. The progress of this lawsuit is kept confidential by the lawyers, and it is not clear whether she actually has that amount. However, one of the clauses in the process is that Alyssa must notify if she receives any kind of compensation due to publicity from the case. Considering the current craze for series and movies about real serial killers, this turns out to be a great strategy by Elizabeth's mother to prevent her daughter's killer from receiving any kind of financial compensation for such a cruel crime. And finally, Nimia Griego earned the title of the most feared child when, at 15 years old, he coldly murdered his entire family. The crime took place on the night of the 19th of January, 2013, in New Mexico. On that occasion, the young Nimia Griego was armed with 2 rifles when he entered his parents' bedroom shortly after midnight and attacked his mother. As he later reported, his younger brother was sleeping next to their mother and didn't want to believe that Nimia had shot her. He had to show his brother their mother's body to convince him of what he'd done, before also shooting him. After that, he went on to attack his 2 younger sisters, aged 5 and 2. But the story doesn't end there. That's because his father wasn't home at the time. He would only return in the morning. Nimia knew this and set up an ambush for his father, shooting him the moment he walked into the house. After committing such a horrific act, he went to the local church, where he tried to justify himself, still holding the weapons, but was soon subdued by the pastor and a retired detective who happened to be there. His testimony was quite disturbing, as he claimed to have done it after an argument with his mother and, consumed by troubling thoughts, he planned to go to public places, shooting at people until the police arrived and shot him. During his trial, there was uncertainty about what to do, whether he should be tried in a juvenile or adult court. Initially, a juvenile court determined that he should remain in a rehabilitation center until he turned 21, but after an appeal by the prosecutor, that sentence was overturned. Nemia was tried as an adult and found guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder, as well as 3 counts of child abuse resulting in death. He was sentenced to 3 life sentences, plus an additional 7 years. In 2022, the New Mexico Supreme Court upheld his conviction, rejecting claims that the punishments were too severe. Additionally, they also ruled that he will only be eligible for a sentence review in 2043, when he will be 52 years old. He is currently incarcerated at the Lee County Correctional Center, and his case remains one of the most cited whenever the question arises. To what extent can teenagers be held accountable as adults? His defense continues to argue that, in reality, he needed psychological help, being a victim of his own traumas. Meanwhile, the prosecutors claim that the perpetrator of such a cold and calculated crime deserves to be behind bars. And you, what is your opinion about all of this? Be sure to leave your comment.